Thank you, Elena and Ron, for putting the show together. And thank you to all of you for coming out to see the work, to see the show. If you remember a piece that I had in the last show, if you saw that, there was a woman in a ring with all these men looking up at her, called Susie Q. This was the same model that posed for that. She was so muscular that I had to smooth her out a bit. She could have whipped me in a quick minute, I think. This piece was done for a show that was put together, curated by a former student for Art Center, Natalia Fabia, who paints her friends, calls them all of her girlfriends hookers, paints them in their lingerie. And so they had a show called Hookers. And I was invited to be in it, and was happy to be in the show that she was putting together, but didn't know exactly what I'd do at first. And then remembered this young woman had posed for me, and thought, she tried some really wild poses. And I finally told her, I can't really use these. Why don't you, here, hold this glass. And so I had already had that reference material, and I figured out something I could do with it. That then related to the show. And so something about, a John and a hooker, I guess, was pretty obvious. But I related it to a painting in the back that's very famous in Russian painting history by Fedotov, called The Major's Marriage Proposal. And basically, over here, the part you don't see the painting, there's an old man outside the living room of this Russian family who is a major who's going to be marrying this young woman who's being introduced to him for the first time, and she's running out of the room in horror. And there were a number of these paintings made that sort of showed the plight of young women who are forced to marry these old geezers. And so, that's the background of the painting that's there. And the painting is called Bubbly, and doesn't need much explanation beyond that, I think. This is a little painting that started out as an egg tempera and oil mixed technique demo in class, and then I took it years later and shifted it around quite a bit, made a lot more out of it. So there used to be another guy in the back, took him out and changed it a lot, but it glows a lot because of that egg tempera. This egg tempera that goes in underlayers makes paintings very luminous. The content of it developed sort of organically because I was reacting to something that I already had. The trouble in posing things in a classroom for me is generally making something that is a little more than just a figure sitting there. And very often I don't succeed at it, but sometimes I do. And in this case, the thing over her head kind of worked kind of nicely in putting together some sort of content and some sort of a sexual affair of some sort has happened here. You don't know quite what. Outside cityscape is New York from your window of your house. I don't know if you do that. I had painted that scene before, and so I had some reference material on that, and that's what that is. Did you recognize it?
I thought it was down. It's from New York, that building has changed slightly.
Yeah. This painting is called The Ledger. A few years ago, was in the hospital, nearly died from burst appendix, and I'd been at home for a week with these pains, and I didn't do anything about it. And finally, I'd gone to one doctor and had been sort of misdiagnosed with some sort of gallstones or something, and so I wasn't too worried, and then I ended up in the emergency room and spent a week in the hospital and nearly died. When I got out and recovered, this was the first painting that I did, called The Ledger. And, it has multiple meanings, of course. It could be a landlord, the art dealer, or a collector, or somebody coming to the artist studio, or it could be death coming to the artist studio. So I saw it in saw many facets of possible meaning to it. And I like to leave things open so that it's not nailed down absolutely as to what it is. He's pointing, there's a check here. He's pointing to vermilion. Anybody who's bought extra vermilion from Old Holland, $50 a tube now, it's a very expensive thing. So this is all Vermilion, that connecting up. He's in a green coat, a green shirt, a little bit of green here, and there's green getting on Death's, a little bit of Death's suit there, if that's who this is. So a little bit of a roundabout thing happening, going back and forth. My wife and one daughter, I was going to try to put both daughters in, but she was away at college, and I didn't have her, so I tried to invent her face, and it turned out looking like a total stranger. That happens. But so, you know, they're sort of off to the side. The young daughter wanted to bring in this box of pastries, but being blocked for the moment while business is taken care of in the studio. If you have any questions about anything while I'm talking, don't bother. Don't worry about interrupting me. There's not really a train of thought to
What about the temporary eagle? The winged eagle thing personally on it?
It's some sort of a hawk attacking a tern. I can't remember who did it originally. I found the source material and then changed it quite a bit so it would fit in there, but that's what that was. This is Titian. I guess sort of a three graces kind of thing going on. Judgment, balance.
Does everything have an exact meaning, or do you sometimes have some things?
Everything has several exact meanings. Usually contradictory. Which is something I like about painting, that you can have different meanings going on at the same time, and they can be totally opposite. And it does still disturb the flow of whatever the narrative might be that you might be finding. Both things could be many things could be happening at once. And I find that exciting. But that disturbs some people. A lot of people over the years have come up to me, and a few have actually gotten angry that I didn't tell them a story. I don't have one story to tell them. I have several stories. I usually try to lead you down a certain path. It means this and this and this, but then hopefully a lot of paths are opened up to you. Painting over here, still life. That is somehow related to the Paternal Suit show that was just being talked about. My father disappeared from my life for 32 years, and when I found him again in 1998, he had all these hints about a family history that were kind of dark and intriguing, Confederate stuff about a senator and a general, but he didn't know their names, and it took me another 5 years until I was out in Connecticut and with collectors there who are here today, and Carol had this genealogical knowledge that helped track down who these people were. And so I started off on this path of discovering all these things about family history, and had a lot of things around the studio, and this painting came out of the accumulated detritus and other things that were accumulating for that Paternal Suit show. So this is a puppet that I have of my great-great-great-grandfather, a senator from Georgia, who was one of the guys who helped to start the Civil War, who at one point had a debate with Abraham Lincoln in 1848. And so he works into it. Some of these other ancestral faces here. This is the general who was one of the worst generals in the Civil War era. It's a Confederate brigadier general who lost repeatedly and was finally fired by Lee. He was so bad, but he was in all the great battles. He had this great military history, but you know, he's not the kind of ancestor that most Southerners would hold up to. Oh, this is my illustrious ancestor. This one sort of gets hidden most of the time. But anyhow, he's great for me. So I call this piece a blight of ancestors. Over to this piece. This is called Nostalgio's Breakfast. I have been teaching for a few years at Laguna College of Art Design with the MFA program, and I had a class there about narrative. And in my introductory talk to that, I talk about narrative quotes by people like James Elkin, that narrative is dead, and that nobody does narrative, and that artists, will now have just open stories. That it's a little bit different than it ever was in the past, where there's no particular story. There's many, many possibilities in a painting in narrative. So that narrative is always open-ended, and for that reason, not really a narrative. And so I decided in painting I was just going to do a narrative and see how that turned out. So I chose one from Boccaccio's Decameron, and it had been painted before in 4 panels by Botticelli. And it's about a young man who is in love with a woman who does not return his advances at all. She's not interested. And he's ready to kill himself, but he's told by his friends, oh, she's never going to love you, forget it. Just go out in the woods, forget her for a while, go, entertain yourself in the nearby beautiful woods. So he's out there, and in the morning, he sees a knight chasing a nude woman through the woods with his hounds, and he's about to kill her, and Nastaggio jumps out with a stick and beats the knight off and says, hey, what are you doing? You can't do this. And the knight says, Nastaggio, I know your whole story. I know, there's this woman in love. Just like I was once in love with this young woman, she rejected my advances, so I killed myself, and then in remorse she killed herself. So for all eternity I have to chase her down here every morning and then kill her, and my hounds rip her guts out. Every day at this time, this morning, at this particular time. And Nastaggio's shot, but he goes away and he starts thinking, well, if he's doing this every morning, then I have a plan. So he invited this young woman and her entire family to a lavish breakfast out in the woods. Set up the tables, and as you can see here in the Botticelli, the scene is reenacted in front of this young woman who's rejected him and all of her family, and they're all horrified. Making a long story short, within a month they were married. She didn't want that to happen to her. So that's the story. It's got this whole long narrative behind it. I found that people do not react to this any more differently than they do to my other paintings, that without knowing that whole story, it's the same sort of thing. And I've always thought that about Western art. I don't have to know a story, in a museum that goes with a painting. I don't have to know the religious story, the mythological story to still really appreciate the painting. I look at it and maybe I get a clue from it, and maybe I don't. But I don't have to know that complete story to enjoy the work. In fact, very often the stories go well beyond the narrative. It's something that's much grander than that. And you see a lot of horrible, say religious work in churches and all throughout Europe. They're just boring paintings. Same story as maybe Michelangelo or Leonardo did, who did it in a fantastic way. So it's sort of what the artist does with it. It's not whether it's a story that's complete or not. A couple of still lifes here. I occasionally do still lifes, not that often, but I try to do stories in them, or the possibility of a story. And so, the obviously symbol like an apple is kind of a loaded one. And I had fun with the apple being partially bitten, and then sort of a dentistry book here where the teeth are opening, and so little funny things I think in a piece that I like, and apple symbolism up in here. And of course the apple's loaded as a symbol anyway. This is a little bit more intense still life, I guess, called Funny Man's Wake. For the longest time I didn't have a cell phone, and when I started teaching, the department chair said, well, you have to have a cell phone so I can reach you whenever I want. And so I have in the cell phone, this just came with the camera, something called panorama mode, so I can shoot all of you as I'm talking here and post you on Facebook. So it takes this amazing long shot. Now if I take the shot and go like this, everything starts to break up. And I like those shots the most, where the usual horizon line that we base our linear perspective on, and that most of the perspective in most Western art is based on, starts to shatter when you do this, because when I'm walking around looking at you like this, my eyes are constantly shifting, my brain's putting it all back together. It becomes a stable picture. I know exactly what I'm looking at. This camera does the same thing. It sort of does what the human brain does. And so the first time I saw that, I was really quite fascinated with it, and started playing with it a bit. And I'd pull it out at parties and shoot the table or whatever. And I put a couple of those together and then reconstructed a few things. Obviously, there wasn't a bear at the dinner. She didn't have 3 hands. But you find that that sort of stuff will be done by the phone. It will make these errors, which I find fascinating. And so I put a couple together, started thinking about it, had it sort of laid out, and for some reason the title Funny Man's Wake popped in my head. And then immediately after that I thought of Finnegan's Wake, which I've never read, and probably most people haven't because it's really difficult to read and doesn't make a lot of sense. And yet I think it's a great piece of art. I think it's really quite wonderful in many ways. I listened to it, parts of it, as I was painting this. But I had listened maybe 5 years ago, maybe even longer than that, 10 years ago, to about 5 hours of tape of a talk about Finnegan's Wake. So some things were in my head about it. And when I started looking at this more closely, there were a lot of things that sort of corresponded with Finnegan's Wake. And I looked it up again, read Wikipedia, of course, the shortened version. But it talked about things, in Finnegan's wife laying him out on the table after he was dead at his own wake to be eaten by the guests. And then he vanished. And so I thought, well, that's kind of a curious thing. And people are in black, too. Once I started discovering some of those connections, then I started adding more and putting in, there's a character, the male character has the initials HCE, so Houth, Castle, and Environs is written about in Finnegan's Wake, so there's a wine that's labeled with that, and this whole building, which is kind of the male phallic side of things. The man in the book is often related to cities and these sort of things, whereas the woman is related to a river. And so the whole table sort of flows off from the River Liffey that flows through Dublin. It's all kind of convoluted because the book is kind of convoluted, very complicated. Yes?
When you said that you sort of put them together, are you doing them like a collage, or are you sketching them and cutting them, or?
There's 2 sections. There's actually a little bit of a seam here. This is the reverse of this, but in a separate shot. So it's the same table looking both ways. Finnegan's Wake begins with a fragment of a sentence and ends with a fragment of a sentence that make one sentence if put it back together, which makes the whole book sort of start again. I can't imagine anybody would start again after going through that. But that sort of was my idea here, I think.
I mean, physically, are you projecting it, or are you cutting it out?
It's not, it doesn't work in that way, because a lot of the things had to be resituated. The perspective of, say, this shot would not have worked with the perspective of this shot, so I had to rework it. Now, they're still not perfect perspective. The way this bottle goes, the way that bottle goes, is not regular linear perspective, but it works in terms of making movement through the painting, because it's sort of what Cezanne did. The perspective in the Cezanne is not quite right in the still lifes. And it animates, in the viewer's mind, it animates the still life. So you're looking at this, and you're kind of wobbling around, and you're traveling back and forth up at this, on this painting. I found that when I had this hanging in the studio, I would just sort of be staring at it, wandering, my eyes would wander across it for long periods of time, and I think it has to do with that movement. Your brain animates what's going on in this, even though it's a still life. It's supposed to be dead. The movement is something I do lecture about and care about quite a bit, trying to create movement. Usually it's with figures. In this case, it was trying to get the things on the table to be animated.
Yes.
Yeah.
I like the panels. How did you come to the idea of setting them in as opposed to having them, not literally triptych, but kind of adjacent?
I think it had to do with just having the 2 separate shots initially that were iPhone inspired. And then when I started putting them back together, one shot would have probably ended here, one shot ended there, and I had these extra spaces, and I thought, well, there must be other, I could do something else with that space rather than just try to fill it out, which would have a blank spot, maybe another person there. Right. Once I sort of started thinking about the split of the male and female parts of the Finnegan's Wake, I could just work that in at opposite ends, and it all made a lot of sense to me. and it's also unusual.
That's
Why should I make a triptych like everybody else's?
Right.
Yes.
Mr. Hess, I have noticed, I think, that in most paintings you include yourself in the painting, and including this one with your hand and the cell phone.
Actually, that's not my hand.
That's
Somebody
you.
else had a cell phone. Everybody's got a cell phone now, so most of them are out on the table and people are looking at it. Yeah, that's not my hand, actually. That's a director that I know, his hand. So.
But you do include yourself.
Most of the time, although I don't think I'm in this one because I took the picture that started it out. I include myself in that one, certainly in this one. Yeah, fair number of them. I'm a cheap model.
What do you use
A good
for
one.
models? I mean, I noticed some of the faces, I see a couple of times. I mean, they're,
Yeah, family members when they're willing. That's my daughter, Aki, in this one. Actually, move over to this piece. So she posed there. My wife doesn't look at all like her, and actually in another painting, an older painting, my older daughter, so all three daughters were into that. Myself twice, arguing with myself, so it's sort of my more emotional, creative side, arguing with the more pragmatic, critical side. So that was a very simple idea that drove this. These guys are kind of just made up, so I do that occasionally too. I have some the MFA students posed in pieces, so wherever I can find models, I use them. I sometimes hire people, but prefer to use friends if I can.
Yeah, so I'm struck, Scott, that some of these pieces are very personal and poignant. I mean, they're all personal on some level, but some seem more meta, or you got intrigued by an idea that kind of intellectually and then pursued it. How, is the genesis different every time for a painting, or how does it happen? Are you working out emotions?
Certainly, over the summer, I did 3 paintings, which I still have a couple to talk about that were based on iPhone stuff. And I've never done that before, where I was intrigued by some of their technology. I generally am not even intrigued by, say, a photograph that I find. I might use parts of it, of a photograph. But it was the first time that I looked at an image that I've taken and said, I can really do something with this. I like what it's doing to the space, I guess, and the way the space gets cut up and shifted. And that's unusual that I'm intrigued in that way. It's usually the figurative things are what pull me in, that the interactions, psychological interactions of people are what usually grab me. Whereas in the case of the iPhone stuff, it was a little bit different. I still gravitated toward things where that was going on, but it was the space and the destruction of space that really attracted me. And that's not the usual case. But everything's a little bit different in the way it generates.
But you relate this to your father's death, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
that's true. My biologic father, the one who had disappeared for 32 years, died must be almost 2 years ago now. And so this was a painting that after I started it and realized about a week, and it's Irish, my father was of Irish descent, that there must be a connection there too. Although as I started it wasn't in my head that it was related to that, but it became, once it was named Funnyman's Wake, related to Finnegan's Wake, okay, it has to do with him in some way. Yes.
Since you're into narrative painting, can you tell us the narrative of how you structured this? Because it has a lot of different angles that would kind of go in front of each other.
Yeah, and that's because it's about conflict, the angling of these things, which do exist in my studio. This is made up. I wish I had a studio like that. But this stuff is made up. So it was a painting hanging on back of an easel I built that's very large, another painting hanging in front of it, coming at this angle, this going at this angle, and this then cutting into that again. So it was planes kind of conflicting, which is what adds, I guess, in an abstract way to the conflict between these two characters.
But do you do that right at the start? Or
Yes.
do you do?
It's all
planned.
laid out. This was actually painted in black and white underneath it, and then color put on top. So, yes.
So why is the canvas they're arguing over not yet painted? Why are they fighting over an unpainted canvas?
Well, once it's painted, it's too late. He's going to win out. He's got this obnoxious but very emotive shirt on. He's got the wallet, so this is going to win right
Oh, I missed the wallet.
and the critical glasses.
But do you structure pretty much all your paintings like that ahead of time?
I usually have things worked out. I used to be very specific. I'd work everything out maybe anywhere from 5 to in my head. So I don't remember many drawings for this before I capture figures photographically for the most part. I think this one's made up, and she's changed quite a bit. But these figures, I have enough reference, photographic reference from that to work from. I paint from life quite a bit too, but not usually in these paintings. It's usually in demos and things in class. And I think painting from life is important, but I'm not, especially for movement poses like this, it's tough to have a model do that for very long. So I definitely use photography for figures very often. Yes?
Can I ask you a question? I noticed in that one, now that you're talking about working it out in black and white, I've been puzzled by the light on her and the lack of light on him. I mean, he's such an interesting black shape,
Well,
almost
black reflects light less, but light's still coming from the same angle. But he's not going to be as bright because he's in a black suit, so it just doesn't reflect as much
Love the
light.
contrast, okay.
We're almost to the point where we can sit down. Yeah, a couple little paintings here. This one, in my hours a day, I had a painting that was on the roof, which is one of my favorites because it didn't have much in it. I managed to strip out a lot of things. And I was asked later to do an updating of that by my dealer up in San Francisco at the time. And so this was the study for that piece, which then, when I made it larger, was changed again. It did not end up looking like this. But in that painting, it was a middle-aged father and a teenage son who seemed to be kind of in trouble, and the father was reaching out for him. In this one, I just updated it 25 years, so the father is now tiptoeing across the roof very happily, and the son is somewhat upset by that, and thinking of belting him, I guess. This painting, Lift, is based, well, it's hard to say what it's based on. I had, at LCAD, there's a room full of bones and skeletons, and they've got this huge skull, probably of a hippopotamus. And I had a project for my class, had everybody in the class set up one scenario, and I did the same thing. I took a scenario, had my models lift this thing up. I then expanded it and changed it quite a bit, put in a fang. The skull is much longer now, and then taught a couple of techniques in it. So there's egg tempera and oil mixed technique in here again, overlaid with regular oil paint. So it glows in a different way because of that egg tempera. What it means is open to a lot of speculation, I guess. It could mean all sorts of things. So I guess everybody can sit down. A little more water.
Oh, absolutely.
Photographs that I worked on, called Primavera. The thing that I found most difficult, I loved what the iPhone did to the space. I found it very difficult to do this to a figure where I shattered a face, broke it up in 3 parts. I've spent my entire life trying to make figures look believable in space and realistic and alive, and to take it and do that was really hard. For me, it felt like I was, sinning in some way. The rest I really loved, what the space is doing this, and it sort of cracks on her and bends the other way. All the adults, it's like a child's party, but all the adults, you can't really see their faces. You only see the kid's face. That was a little busted balloon that she was looking down at. So metaphor was pretty blatant in terms of that. But as I was painting, it felt to me like the Lars von Trier movie Melancholia, where it's sort of the end of the world, and you don't realize it at the beginning when you're watching the film, and as you get further into the film, you realize that a lot of the things that were disturbing in the film were because of the end of the Earth coming, and at the very end of the film, of course, the Earth gets hit by this comet. But it sort of has something of that feel to me. There's a nostalgic kind of warm glow to it that lends us also sort of the light in that film. This is the neighborhood of Los Feliz where I live now. Many years I was in Echo Park. This is sort of the view out from my neighbor's house, not from my house. Yeah, when I was painting the chairs, this would normally be something that would be kind of boring. So each section I painted differently. It's a little bit different pattern here and here and here and here and here and here and here. They don't quite match up, but from a distance they look like a chair. Transfiguration. You can see what the original Transfiguration, which is a slide that I use a lot in lectures, for several reasons. One of them is that the point of view of the viewer, you're kept at a distance, and this Transfiguration is something you as a human being are never going to understand. It has deep religious significance and it's mystical. So you're kept away by both a canyon and a fence from action. So you're just distanced from things. Christ, with his hands up, is cool along with the heavens. Everything else is earth-colored. So in some ways, that played into this, where I, in some way, am relating to that tree which is being cut down, and the coloring is somewhat similar to the sky. So it was sort of the loss of the tree was felt through the figure, I guess, in the painting. This piece is the third piece I did over the summer from the iPhone photos, but then a lot of stuff shifted and changed and got condensed from, it's not one image. I'm not just taking one image and working from that. So a lot of stuff changed in it, including adding food, adding people. I think this was in the original photo. I really liked the way that face had just broken off, and I got a separate sort of a mask-like image in front of this other figure who's laughing even harder behind that. I thought, oh, that's fantastic. I like that a lot. But other things changed a lot. This was a dinner at a fundraiser at the Laguna College of Art and Design. And I was at one of the artist tables, which is not up in the front where the money is. You get put in the back of the artist. And all the artists were younger than me, because a lot of them had been my students. And so the table 58, which is the title, relates to my age, my current age. And it was just sort of it's always a strange thing at these fundraisers anyway, when the artwork is being auctioned and you're the person that made it. It's always a little bit strange, disconcerting. You're drinking a fair amount. So I wanted to get across some of that feeling, and the iPhone certainly added to that sense of displacement and breaking up. Again, I left that section till the very end. Everything else was filled in, except for that. Midway through the painting, shattering that figure in the middle was, again, very difficult for me. And that then, in turn, related to some of the content. A little poem being written out here that has to do with those saints that never rot. They'll die, and their bodies never supposedly disintegrate or rot in any way. Of course, you see them and they look pretty horrible in most churches, but that idea of that holiness and holding together was sort of that idea of keeping figures together for me and not breaking them up. So the poem being written is about the shattering of reality, which then I related to internet stuff. Everybody's online, and there's this constant stream of imagery that I get online, and most people are on their phones seeing constantly. So she's on her phone, and there's just this cascade of things coming out of her hair that relate to internet life. And my life has a lot of paintings in it online, but also dogs surfing or pretty cats or nudes or racist stuff or whatever, penguin. All these things that are interrelated just come at you constantly. And so that those things just worked their way into the painting. I hadn't planned at the beginning, but had a lot of fun putting it in. So that the painting, it works sort of on different levels. Again, the breakup of space was what initially attracted me to it. It is sort of like a cubist breakup of space, but I think the iPhone does it so much better than Picasso did. It's just very organic, it just flows. It's kind of wonderful.
The ghostly finger is pointing at anything in particular?
Well, it's sort of, there's little hands coming in, so it balances out some of the hands. They have these lights. They look like flowers, big floppy white flowers. And I thought, oh, it'd just be more interesting if it was a finger. And so it just sort of, there's enough surreal stuff coming in there anyway. I mean, it doesn't really matter. So there's this finger pointing and things bring you back around and sort of keep you moving. It has something to do with moving through space, but once I had it there, I thought, oh, this is great. I really love the hand in here. But initially it was just these weird hanging flowers that were the light source of this auction.
Is there any significance to the pictures you've chosen as background?
Well, that's my paternal suit. So those are images from the paternal suit here. Not so much this stuff, but those are images from the paternal suit. And yeah, history, I guess, my own history coming into that. This piece is called Anchises Lost. Anchises was the father of Aeneas, who was a Trojan warrior. When the Greeks beat the Trojans, they gave the males the right to carry as much of their family treasure out as they could. And Aeneas carried out his father, which really impressed the Greeks. Instead of carrying treasure, he carried out his father, who had been lamed, I guess, in the war, or lamed at some point. And in the process of leaving Troy, which was burning, he lost his wife and son. They died. And this was a favorite story of my father-in-law, who liked the idea that, you can always get another wife and son, but you'll never get another father. And
You're sort of the wrong person.
exactly. But I took that, as sort of a symbol of what the uplifting of the paternal in Western society, and changed that a little. So this is Anchises, the burning of Troy, I guess, in a modern sense. Lost is Aeneas there, and his wife and kid are running off with all the goods of the house, and Aeneas is left in this blinding light, whatever that might be. So again, a fairly direct narrative in many ways, but it changed the original story quite a bit. Here, I guess you see him carrying his father out and his wife and child about to be lost, I guess. And so one more big piece here. It's called All the Goods of the World. This one was a direct, initially it was a direct confrontation with the death of my father. I'd done one small painting that didn't work for me. It was I thought, it ended up being a good painting, but it didn't really get to the root of the problem. So this initially for me was about my parents' divorce. And that's when I started making art. When I was 7 years old, I got divorced. I started making these magical drawings to stop the crumbling of my world. And so, after his death, I thought, I should probably be grappling with this in some way. And this painting came about because it was a painting of Rubens that I'd always loved, the Drunken Silenus, and it had a lot of movement in it. And so I started thinking of a painting where I would put in my ancestral past here, the senator and the general, as sort of the inescapable things that have to do with genealogy and genetics. And the figure, there's a black man pinching Silenus on the butt. It took me a year, looking at this painting for a year and lecturing about it occasionally about the movement in it before I realized that what was being depicted was anal sex. And it was quite a shock to, holy crap. And so, but, when I came to put my painting together, I added a little carrot here. The genetic background is going to get you no matter what. When I went to pose people for it, I used MFA students. This one has some contemporary in it too. The nice thing about working after an old masterpiece like that is that you start to see, because you change things and you have to adjust because of those changes, you start to learn about that Rubens quite a bit. And just the way he circled that figure with certain lighter forms. So I started putting egg tempera white under some of these figures, in that figure, this figure, under that one, on his shirt, up there, and in the roses. So there's kind of a circle that goes around that kind of was trying to do some of what I was seeing in the Rubens to get the composition to flow around that figure a bit.
Is the disgrace Confederate general supposed to resemble you?
Yeah, I posed both of them. I figured there must be some resemblance somehow still. So I posed both of them. Yes.
And the child, which might be you when you were 7, is that someone you know, or is that?
No, that head's made up. You know, looking at the Rubens a little bit, made up. It ended up looking like a guy that lives out in New York that collected some of my work, which is pretty funny. And I don't think he saw the connection, but I did. And he's got a goat thing. Those magic drawings I started making when I was 7 were erotic drawings, so somehow the goat boy related to that. And if you look at the Rubens, what you don't notice at first is there are 2 goats there in the corner copulating. So it's, again, you don't see them for the first year you look at the painting. So that related there. That's my dog Roxy, who's also on Facebook, and you can friend her if you'd like.
She's a famous artist.
Yes, she's a conceptual artist. She doesn't like what I do. But
So is this innocent baby about to be stepped on?
at least tripped over, I think. That's my guess. Yeah, I can't tell you what's going to happen next. I guess the movement is going to be hard to stop at that point. But it's the same in the Rubens. And you know, looking at the Rubens, my constant sort of question as I'm doing mine is, what was in his mind? Why did he put this together? Psychologically, this was an important painting. He kept it his entire life, and so you know, he loved that painting, and it was important to him. And I wonder what it meant. You know, it's kind of hard to decipher. So any questions about anything else?
Scott, you know, I think the other thing too, with the Rubens, it's a painting that grew, meaning it was smaller in size, and you kept adding canvases to it. So
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I love that idea, the way your painting has grown.
Well, I hope it stops growing. It's big.
Really nice. Can you tell us what you're feeling at this stage of your career in life based on...
Exhaustion. Yeah, I haven't painted for months just because of all the openings and all these other things going on. So teaching too, so it's been exhausting.
But any reflections after seeing your early work up and confronting it anew?
I think that, you know, my painting is, it was interesting to see the changes it's gone through, lined up in Fullerton, because it was much looser, I think, when I was younger, and then I learned a lot more about technical things. The later paintings, I think, glow a little bit more, because I've learned how to layer the works in such a way that they're more luminous. The brushstroke has shifted. It's still there, but it's a little bit tighter than it was.
And more nuanced.
And more nuanced. I think that came with learning a lot of the different techniques, especially through the Hours a Day series. I was picking up different techniques with different paintings and trying those out. And still it had to be coherent as a group. But I tried a lot of different things, and all of that still is in play. But so, you know, so is the brushwork from my earliest paintings. The way I put together this, using a lot of little strokes rather than one big even area, that has to do with the way I learned to paint, which was derived out of French painting, even Van Gogh and Bonnard and some of that stuff. So, you know, that dot stuff is still in me. I have a little tiny palette. I like the tiniest palette on any artist I know, just a little thing, and I could paint huge paintings with that. It used to be, it was small on purpose because I might have a 6 by 8 foot painting. I had to climb up and down with my palette to work on it. Having a big palette would not have worked so well, so I've always just had a small palette.
I think the other question I have is that throughout your career, there's always been these animations of composition and dynamics of views, and this feels to me like this body of work feels to me like there's a new high in your work in that particular category vis-a-vis using the iPhone. So at this stage, what might be in your mind for the future, given this culmination or new development?
Well, I've talked about, not liking breaking the figures up. I'm going to break some more up.
Okay.
So I'm not sure exactly how that's going to play out yet. But the idea both disgusts me and intrigues me. So I'm going to do some of it. I don't know what's going to happen with it. There's a lot of different possibilities with it, I think, and different directions it could go. And that maybe I'll try them all. I don't know. But I do have some ideas that relate to that still.
That sounds exciting for us, and for me, it's sort of Picasso eat your heart out.
I have a
Just imagine what
question.
would have happened if Picasso had an iPhone.
I have a question. These last several newer works have to do with a way of seeing, and there's not so much a tip of the hat to more historical work.
There are probably things you can start to relate this to. And, besides the direct references to things in the back that are paintings, I think, it's still in there. It's not, it's not as direct as maybe something like this one. But I think those.
So we shouldn't look for a Last Supper in any of this.
No, but.
Great idea.
If anything, it's.
Maybe one last question,
Folies
Scott?
Bergère.
Yes, last question.
If anything, it's not a question.
Yes.
It's just sort of like Manet's Folies Bergère, where you expect the little hanging dancer.
Little feet from the back, yes. Instead you get a surfing dog. Thanks everybody for coming.